The spring of 1945 brought with it a silence that felt almost unnatural across the German countryside. After nearly 6 years of relentless warfare, the once mighty Wehrmacht found itself collapsing under the weight of Allied advances from both east and west. But what many don't realize is that in those final months, something unprecedented occurred. Over 500,000 German soldiers made a calculated, desperate choice. They didn't just surrender. They actively sought out American forces, sometimes marching for days, abandoning their positions, even defying direct orders from their commanders. The question that haunted the closing days of the European theater wasn't whether Germany would lose, but rather why so many soldiers were willing to risk execution for desertion just to ensure they surrendered to the Americans rather than anyone else. What were they so afraid of that the prospect of American captivity seemed like salvation? If you're fascinated by untold stories from history and want to dive deeper into the human experiences behind world-changing events, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring more of these incredible stories to light. The story begins not in the chaos of battle, but in the quiet desperation of a field hospital near the Ruhr Valley in early April 1945. Obergefreiter Klaus Zimmermann lay on a thin cot, his left leg wrapped in bloodied bandages from shrapnel wounds sustained during an artillery barrage 3 days prior. The 24-year-old former schoolteacher from Hamburg had spent the last 4 years serving in various capacities across the eastern and western fronts. Now, as morphine dulled the throbbing pain in his leg, he listened to the whispered conversations of other wounded soldiers around him. Klaus remembered his last day of teaching before the war with painful clarity. It had been August of 1941, a warm afternoon in Hamburg. He had been explaining geometry to his class when the principal entered with his conscription notice. The students had watched in silence as he read the paper, understanding that their teacher was being called to serve. He had told them he would return when the war ended, promised to continue their lessons. He wondered how many of those students were still alive, how many had themselves been conscripted into this endless conflict that consumed everything. The years between that August afternoon and this April morning had transformed Klaus in ways he could barely comprehend. He had seen action in North Africa briefly before being transferred to the Eastern Front for 2 years. The things he witnessed there haunted his dreams. Villages burned to the ground, civilians shot for suspected partisan activity. Prisoners marched until they dropped and left to die in the snow. He had not participated directly in the worst atrocities, but he had been present. He had witnessed. And he knew that on the vast plains of Russia and Ukraine, German forces had committed acts that would demand retribution. The hospital, if it could even be called that, was nothing more than a requisitioned farmhouse with its windows blown out and walls pockmarked by bullet holes. Medical supplies had dwindled to almost nothing. The doctors, exhausted and demoralized, did what they could with bandages that had been washed and reused so many times they were falling apart. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery grew steadily closer, a constant reminder that the front lines were collapsing. In the cot next to Klaus lay Feldwebel Ernst Hoffmann, a 38-year-old career soldier who had served since the invasion of Poland in '39. Ernst's injuries were internal, the result of blast trauma from a bomb that had landed too close to his position. His weathered face, etched with lines that seemed to have deepened with every year of war, bore the expression of a man who had seen too much. Ernst had joined the military in 1936, believing in the promise of restoring German pride after the humiliations of Versailles. He had been a patriot, a believer in duty and honor. But 6 years of war had stripped away his illusions layer by layer. He had fought in Poland, France, and then spent 2 brutal years on the Eastern Front before being transferred west. His wife Maria and their 3 children were somewhere in eastern Germany, possibly already overrun by Soviet forces. The not knowing was its own special torture. During his time on the Eastern Front, Ernst had witnessed the systematic destruction of entire communities. He remembered a village called Katyn in Belarus. Though there were so many villages, it was hard to keep them separate in his memory. The partisan attacks had been brutal, yes, but the German response had been disproportionate and indiscriminate. He had watched as soldiers herded civilians into a barn and set it aflame. The screams still echoed in his nightmares. He had not participated, had in fact turned away, but his inaction made him complicit. And now Soviet forces were advancing through those same territories, discovering the evidence of what had been done. "You hear what happened to Müller's company?" Ernst asked in a low voice, his eyes fixed on the water-stained ceiling. Klaus turned his head slightly. The morphine made everything feel distant and dreamlike, but Ernst's tone cut through the haze. "I heard they scattered," Klaus replied, "ordered to hold the bridge at Remagen, but most of them just disappeared into the countryside." Ernst gave a slight nod, wincing as the movement sent pain through his torso. "They didn't scatter randomly, Klaus. They went west. Deliberately, 300 men, maybe more, all heading in the same direction, toward the American lines." Klaus felt a chill, despite the mild spring air filtering through the broken windows. Desertion carried an automatic death sentence. Military police were still executing soldiers found abandoning their posts, stringing them up from lampposts with signs around their necks as warnings to others. The fear of these impromptu executions had kept many units fighting long past the point of military logic. Why would they risk that? Klaus asked, though part of him already knew the answer. He had heard the stories, passed in whispers between soldiers during the brief moments of respite from combat. Ernst's eyes darkened with a knowledge that seemed to weigh on him physically. Because what's waiting for them, if they surrender to the Russians, makes hanging look merciful, he said quietly. "I served 2 years on the Eastern Front before they transferred me west. I saw what we did there, Klaus. The villages we burned, the civilians we shot, the prisoners we starved. The Russians, they have long memories and no mercy left." The unspoken reality hung heavy in the stale air of the makeshift hospital. German forces had committed systematic atrocities across Eastern Europe, from mass executions to scorched earth policies that left entire regions devastated. Soviet forces advancing from the east had discovered the evidence of these crimes firsthand, and their desire for retribution was fierce and unyielding. Stories filtered back through the ranks of German soldiers about the fate of those captured by Soviet forces. The brutal treatment, the summary executions, the forced marches to labor camps in Siberia, where survival was measured in months rather than years. "But the Americans," Ernst continued, his voice gaining a slight note of hope that seemed almost out of place in their grim surroundings. "They follow rules. Geneva Convention. They process prisoners properly, provide medical care, adequate food. I've talked to soldiers who were captured at Normandy and later escaped. They said the Americans treated them correctly, by the book. Not well exactly, but correctly. There's a difference." Klaus absorbed this information, his mind working through the implications despite the fog of medication. The choice facing every German soldier had become starkly simple. Surrender to the Soviets and face almost certain death or decades of brutal labor, or somehow make it to the American lines and have a reasonable chance of surviving the war as a prisoner of war, with basic human rights protected. That night, as Klaus drifted in and out of feverish sleep, he dreamed of his classroom in Hamburg. 26 young faces looking up at him expectantly as he explained mathematical theorems on the chalkboard. The dream shifted, as dreams do, and suddenly the classroom was filled not with students, but with Soviet soldiers, their faces hard and unforgiving. He woke with a start, his heart racing, the phantom pain in his leg flaring despite the morphine. The next morning brought news that accelerated everyone's calculations. An orderly moved through the hospital, informing the wounded that American armored divisions had broken through 30 kilometers to the west and were advancing rapidly. Soviet forces were reported to be 60 kilometers to the east, but closing fast. The gap between the two advancing armies was narrowing by the hour, and everyone in that hospital understood what it meant. They had a narrow window to decide their fate. The chief medical officer, a gaunt man named Dr. Wilhelm Brandt, who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks, gathered those who could walk or hobble. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed his own fear and exhaustion. "We have orders to evacuate the hospital and move east, away from the American advance," he announced. "Transport trucks will arrive this afternoon. Those who cannot be moved will remain here with a skeleton medical staff." Klaus exchanged glances with Ernst. They both understood the bitter irony. Moving east meant potentially falling into Soviet hands. Remaining meant almost certainly being captured by advancing American forces. For Klaus, with his injured leg, the choice was being made for him, unless he could somehow convince the doctors he was mobile enough to evacuate. Ernst made his decision quickly. "I'm walking out of here," he told Klaus that afternoon, as the sound of truck engines approached. "My injuries, they're not visible. I can move. I'm going west. You'll be shot if the military police catch you," Klaus warned, though his voice lacked conviction. They both knew the alternative was worse. "Then I won't get caught," Ernst replied with a thin smile. He had found civilian clothes somewhere, probably from one of the abandoned farmhouses nearby. The transformation was remarkable. In moments, the career soldier disappeared, and in his place stood what appeared to be a middle-aged farmer. "Come with me, Klaus. Your leg, it's bad, but you can walk with support. We find a cart, some crutches, anything. Together we have a better chance." Klaus felt the pull of survival instinct, warring with years of military discipline and loyalty. He thought of his family in Hamburg, his mother and younger sister. What would happen to them if he was executed as a deserter? But then again, what would happen to them if he disappeared into Soviet captivity, never to return? The reports from the Eastern Front suggested that captured German soldiers were not coming back, at least not for many years, perhaps never. The decision crystallized in that moment. "I'll come with you," Klaus said quietly. "But we need a story. Something that explains why we're traveling west, away from the evacuation routes." Ernst had already thought of this. "We're brothers, returning to our family farm. You were injured in an air raid. I'm taking you home. The front lines are chaos. Nobody's checking papers carefully anymore. We just need to stay ahead of our own military police and reach American lines before the Soviets close the gap." That night, as the hospital evacuated in a convoy of overloaded trucks heading east, Klaus and Ernst slipped away in the opposite direction. Klaus leaned heavily on a makeshift crutch fashioned from a broken chair leg, his wounded leg throbbing with each step. Ernst carried a small pack with their few possessions and some medical supplies he had quietly taken from the hospital stores. The April night was cool but not cold, with a thin crescent moon providing just enough light to navigate by. They stuck to small country roads and farm paths, avoiding the main highways where military traffic and patrols would be concentrated. The countryside around them bore the scars of war. Fields lay untended, farmhouses stood abandoned or damaged, and occasionally they passed the burned-out hulk of a vehicle or the crater from an artillery shell. Their first hours of travel were marked by constant fear. Every sound made them freeze, expecting either military police or combat patrols. Klaus's injured leg made their progress agonizingly slow. Every step sent jolts of pain through his body, and he had to stop frequently to rest. Ernst remained patient, understanding that rushing would only make Klaus's condition worse and potentially draw attention to them. Around 3 in the morning, they heard the sound of vehicles approaching from behind. There was no time to hide properly. They pressed themselves against a hedgerow beside the road, hoping the darkness would conceal them. Two military trucks passed, traveling fast without lights, presumably under blackout conditions. The trucks were heading east, away from the American advance. Klaus caught a glimpse of soldiers in the back, young faces looking exhausted and terrified, more troops being rushed to plug holes in defensive lines that no longer existed in any meaningful sense. After the trucks passed, Ernst and Klaus waited another 20 minutes before resuming their journey. The close call had shaken them both. If those trucks had stopped, if anyone had seen them, their journey would have ended with summary execution or forced return to their units. The risk they were taking became more real with each passing hour. As dawn approached, they encountered a burned-out farmhouse that offered potential shelter. The main building was too exposed, but there was a stone root cellar mostly intact. They descended into the darkness, finding it empty, except for some old preserves in jars and the musty smell of earth and potatoes. It was not comfortable, but it was concealed. They could rest here during daylight hours and continue under cover of darkness. Klaus used this time to change the dressing on his leg wound. The infection was worsening despite the antibiotics from the hospital. The flesh around the shrapnel wound was inflamed and hot to the touch. Without proper medical care soon, he risked sepsis. Ernst watched with concern, but said nothing. They both knew that Klaus needed treatment beyond what they could provide with their limited supplies. During that day of hiding, they talked more about their families, their lives before the war. Ernst spoke of his childhood in a small town in Bavaria, how he had worked as an apprentice carpenter before joining the military. He described his wife Maria, a schoolteacher like Klaus, and his children. His oldest son, Friedrich, would be 16 now, possibly already conscripted into the Volkssturm. His daughter Anna was 14, and his youngest son Peter was only 11. The thought of them facing Soviet soldiers, of what might happen to German civilians in the path of the Red Army's advance, was unbearable. Klaus shared his own fears for his family in Hamburg. His mother was elderly and in poor health. His younger sister Charlotte was 20 and worked in a factory that produced aircraft parts. The Allied bombing of Hamburg had been devastating. He did not know if their apartment building still stood, if his family had survived. The last letter he received had been 3 months ago, and much could have changed since then. As evening fell and they prepared to continue their journey, they heard voices outside. German voices speaking quietly. Ernst peered cautiously from the cellar entrance and saw 3 soldiers, all very young, sitting by the ruins of the farmhouse, sharing what appeared to be their last rations. These were deserters too, or perhaps stragglers separated from their units. The question was whether to reveal themselves or wait for the soldiers to move on. Ernst made the decision to approach them. 3 more men could provide additional security, and in numbers there was some safety. He climbed out of the cellar slowly, hands visible, and called out in a low voice. The 3 soldiers jumped up, hands moving to weapons, but Ernst quickly explained they were not a threat, that they too were heading west to surrender to the Americans. The 3 young soldiers were from a panzer division that had been destroyed in fighting near Kassel. They had been separated from their unit during a retreat and had decided independently to head west rather than try to regroup. The oldest of them, a corporal named Thomas Becker, was barely 21. The other 2, privates named Dieter Schultz and Martin Kemp, were 18 and 17 respectively. All 3 looked haunted, their eyes holding the 1,000-yard stare of men who had seen too much combat, too young. Thomas explained that they had been traveling for 4 days, hiding during daylight and moving at night. They had encountered military police twice and had barely escaped detection both times. One of their companions had been caught and hanged from a tree as a deserter, his body left as a warning. The memory of seeing their friend's corpse swaying in the wind had eliminated any doubt about continuing west, despite the risks. After several hours of painful progress, they took shelter in a barn as dawn approached. Klaus's leg was agony despite the pain medication he had brought from the hospital, and both men were exhausted. The barn smelled of old hay and neglect, its owners long since fled or killed. Through gaps in the wooden walls, they could see the road they had been following, empty now in the grey pre-dawn light. As they rested, Ernst shared more of what he knew about American forces based on intelligence briefings and soldier accounts. The Americans, they have so much of everything, he explained. Vehicles, fuel, food, ammunition. They fight differently than we do. Less about holding ground at all costs, more about maneuver and firepower. If you surrender to them correctly, hands up, no weapons, no sudden moves, they'll process you as a prisoner and move on. They're not interested in revenge, just in winning the war. Klaus listened carefully, filing away this information. How do we surrender without getting shot, he asked. In the chaos of combat, approaching soldiers could be fatal. Ernst had considered this too. We watch for rear echelon units, supply columns, medical units, not the frontline combat troops who are keyed up and likely to shoot first. We approach in daylight, obviously unarmed, hands visible. We call out in English if we can. I know some basic phrases. We surrender, don't shoot, that sort of thing. They spent that day resting and planning, taking turns, keeping watch. Twice they saw German military vehicles pass on the distant highway. Once, a convoy of trucks filled with troops heading west to reinforce collapsing defensive lines, and later a staff car moving quickly in the opposite direction, probably officers fleeing the advancing front. Neither vehicle came close enough to spot their hiding place. As evening fell, they resumed their journey westward. The sounds of combat were clearer now, particularly when the wind shifted. Artillery rumbled like distant thunder, and occasionally they could make out the sharper crack of tank guns and the chatter of machine gun fire. Somewhere ahead in the darkness, men were fighting and dying in the last desperate battles of a war already lost. They encountered their first refugees around midnight, an elderly couple pulling a wooden cart loaded with possessions, moving slowly along the road. The old man eyed them suspiciously at first, but Ernst's civilian clothes and Klaus's obvious injury seemed to alleviate some concern. The couple was fleeing their farm, terrified of the approaching Soviet forces whose reputation for brutality toward German civilians had spread through word of mouth and propaganda alike. The old woman, her face deeply lined with age and worry, told them about the stories filtering back from the east, entire towns where all the men had been killed or deported. Women subjected to terrible violence, property destroyed or confiscated. Whether all the stories were true or exaggerated by propaganda was impossible to know, but the fear in the old woman's eyes was genuine and deep. "My grandson," she said, her voice trembling. "He was captured by the Russians near Warsaw in January. We heard nothing since. Nothing. His young wife waits with their baby, but I think in my heart he's gone. The Russians, they remember what our soldiers did to their people. They remember the siege of Leningrad, the burned villages, the prisoners starved to death, and now they are repaying us in kind." The old man added his own perspective. "We are farmers. We hurt no one. But we are German, and that is enough. The Russians do not distinguish between those who supported the Nazis and those who just wanted to live in peace. We all wear the same guilt now. The Americans, they're that way?" Ernst asked, pointing west. The old man nodded. 10, maybe 15 kilometers. "But there's still fighting. Our troops are trying to hold them, but everyone knows it's finished. You're smart to go west, young man. The Russians, what they're doing in the east, it's God's judgment on us for what we allowed to happen." Before parting ways, the old woman gave them some bread from her cart, dark rye bread that was stale but edible. "It is not much," she said, "but you boys need strength for your journey. May God protect you and bring you home to your families when this is finally over." The encounter left Klaus deeply affected. These were innocent people, civilians who had no role in military decisions or war crimes, yet they were suffering the consequences of choices made by others. The collective guilt that the old man spoke of was already settling over Germany like a dark cloud. Everyone would bear the weight of what had been done, regardless of their individual culpability. As they continued walking, now joined by Thomas, Dieter and Martin, the group discussed what they knew about American treatment of prisoners. Thomas had fought against American forces in France after D-Day and had witnessed the surrender of part of his unit. He described how the Americans had processed the prisoners efficiently, separated officers from enlisted men, provided medical care to the wounded, and transported everyone to rear area camps. No executions, no beatings, just professional military procedure. Dieter, the youngest of the group, expressed fears that the Americans might turn them over to the Russians. This was a concern that haunted many German soldiers. There were rumors, impossible to verify, that some prisoners were being transferred between Allied powers depending on where they had fought or what units they belonged to. The thought of surviving the journey west, only to be handed over to Soviet forces, was terrifying. Ernst tried to reassure him based on what he knew. The Americans and Russians are allies, but they don't trust each other, he explained. The Americans keep their own prisoners. It's a matter of control and intelligence gathering. They want to interrogate prisoners themselves, learn about German military capabilities and plans. We're more valuable to them in their own hands than transferred to the Soviets. The group continued through the night, their progress slow due to Klaus's injury and their need for constant vigilance. The sounds of artillery grew closer, indicating they were approaching active combat zones. Several times they had to detour around areas that showed signs of recent fighting or where they could see searchlights and activity suggesting military positions. Around 4 in the morning, they witnessed something that reinforced their decision to surrender west. From their position on a hillside, they could see a road below, where a column of German soldiers was being marched east under guard. But these were not American guards. Even in the darkness, the distinctive silhouettes and equipment of Soviet soldiers were recognizable. The German prisoners, perhaps 50 or 60 of them, were being driven at a brutal pace. As Klaus and his companions watched in silence, one prisoner stumbled and fell. A Soviet guard kicked him, and when the man could not rise quickly enough, the guard shot him where he lay, and the column continued without pause. The casual brutality of the execution sent chills through the watching men. That could be their fate if they moved in the wrong direction, if they miscalculated and ended up in Soviet rather than American hands. The incident eliminated any remaining doubts about the wisdom of their desperate journey west. Martin, the youngest, began to cry quietly. He was just 17, had been conscripted only 4 months earlier from his school in Munich. He had seen combat, had watched friends die, but the cold execution they had just witnessed broke something in him. Thomas put an arm around the boy's shoulders, offering what comfort he could. "We keep moving west," he said firmly. "We get to the Americans. We survive this. You're going to see your family again, Martin. Hold on to that." They found shelter in a small woods as dawn broke, too exhausted to continue. Klaus's fever was worsening, and Ernst was growing increasingly concerned about infection. They needed to reach American lines soon, not just for safety, but for medical care that could save Klaus's leg, or possibly his life. The old man's words hung in the air as the couple moved on into the darkness. Klaus and Ernst continued their journey, now part of a growing stream of refugees, soldiers in various states of desertion, and displaced persons all moving in the same direction, away from the Eastern Front and toward what they hoped would be the relative mercy of American captivity. The following day brought them to a crossroads village that had seen recent fighting. Buildings were damaged, windows shattered, and the smell of smoke and death lingered in the air. The village appeared deserted at first, but as they moved cautiously through its streets, they discovered they were not alone. In what had once been the village school, they found approximately 50 German soldiers, most of them young, some barely old enough to shave. These were the remnants of a Volkssturm unit, the last-ditch militia formed from teenagers and old men in the war's final months. The soldiers were in a state of near mutiny. Their commander, a Wehrmacht major who looked dead on his feet, was trying to maintain order and arguing with several of the older Volkssturm members who wanted to surrender immediately. Klaus and Ernst watched from the doorway as the confrontation unfolded. "We have orders to fall back east and regroup," the major insisted, his voice hoarse and strained. "Abandoning our positions is desertion. The penalty is death." An older Volkssturm member, a man who appeared to be in his 50s with a bandage wrapped around his head, stepped forward. His name was Otto Brandt, and he had been a postal worker in peacetime, a father of 4. "Major, with all respect, there is no more regrouping. There is no more war to fight. The Führer is either dead or trapped in Berlin. High Command has abandoned us. These boys," he gestured to the teenage soldiers around him, "they should not die for nothing in the last days of a lost war. We are going west to surrender to the Americans. We would prefer to do so with your blessing, but we will do it regardless." Another voice joined the discussion, this one belonging to a young Volkssturm member who could not have been more than 15. His name was Hans Müller, and his voice cracked with emotion as he spoke. "My brother was killed at Stalingrad, sir. My father died in Normandy. I have a mother and 2 younger sisters at home with no one to care for them. If I die here for nothing, they will starve. I did not ask to be a soldier. I was taken from my school 2 months ago and given a rifle I barely know how to use. I want to go home. I want to live." The major's face went through a series of emotions: anger, desperation, and finally a sort of collapsed resignation. His hand moved to his sidearm, and for a moment Klaus thought he might actually draw it, but then the major's shoulders sagged, and he seemed to age 10 years in an instant. The major looked around at the faces surrounding him, seeing perhaps for the first time the reality of what he was commanding. These were not professional soldiers. They were frightened boys and middle-aged men, torn from their families and given impossible orders. He had been trained to follow orders, to maintain discipline, to never surrender. But what did those principles mean when the war was already lost and continuing to fight only meant more pointless death? "Go," the major said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I cannot stop you all. I will report that we were overrun and scattered. But know that you are throwing away your honor." Otto Brandt's response was gentle but firm. "Honor does not require suicide, Major. These boys deserve a chance to live and rebuild after this war ends. That is the greater honor now. Our country will need living men to rebuild, not dead heroes to mourn." The major sat down heavily on a broken desk, his face in his hands. After a long moment, he looked up at Otto. "And what about me? If I come with you, I am a deserter. If I stay and fight, I die for nothing. If I return east and report what happened, they will shoot me as a failure." "Then come west with us," Otto said simply. "Surrender with your men. You have led them as well as anyone could under impossible circumstances. Lead them one more time, to survival instead of death." The major considered this for a long moment. Klaus could see the internal struggle playing out on the older officer's face. Everything in his training and experience told him that surrender was dishonorable, that a German officer should never give up while still capable of fighting. But the pragmatic reality was undeniable. The war was over in all but name. Fighting on would accomplish nothing except more casualties. Finally, the major nodded slowly. "Very well," he said. "We will organize an orderly surrender to American forces, But we do it correctly as soldiers, not as a rabble. We will maintain formation, we will carry a flag of truce, and we will present ourselves with whatever dignity we can still claim. Within the hour, the group had organized itself for surrender. They stripped off all insignia that might identify them as SS or special units. As rumors suggested, the Americans treated those prisoners more harshly due to their involvement in war crimes. Weapons were carefully gathered and made clearly visible, to be presented as a formal surrender rather than concealed. Someone found a white sheet that they fashioned into a makeshift flag of surrender. As they prepared, Klaus spoke with some of the younger Volksturm members. One boy, who introduced himself as Peter Hoffmann, had been a student at a gymnasium in Berlin before his conscription. He was 16, but looked younger, his face still holding the softness of childhood. Peter confided that he had never fired his rifle at anyone, that his unit had retreated so quickly that they never actually engaged with enemy forces. He was terrified of being shot during the surrender, afraid that American soldiers would not accept their capitulation and would fire on them anyway. Klaus tried to reassure him, drawing on Ernst's knowledge of American procedures. "They will accept our surrender," he told Peter. "The Americans follow rules. They document prisoners. They provide basic care. You will survive this and go home to your family." Another young soldier, Wolfgang Schmidt, had a different fear. He worried about what would happen to Germany after the war, what occupation would mean, whether his family would have enough to eat during what was sure to be a difficult period. These were legitimate concerns that Klaus could not fully address, but he tried to offer what hope he could. "We will rebuild," he said. "Germany has been defeated before and risen again. It will take time, but we will recover." The major, having made his decision, took command of organizing the surrender. He insisted on proper military formation, wanting to surrender as a unit rather than as individual deserters. This was partly about maintaining discipline, but Klaus suspected it was also about the major's own self-respect. If he was going to abandon everything he had believed in about military honor, he would at least do it in a way that preserved some sense of order and dignity. Klaus and Ernst joined this growing column of men moving west. There was safety in numbers, and a large group with a clear flag of surrender was less likely to be mistaken for a combat unit. As they marched, other small groups of soldiers joined them. By mid-afternoon, their number had swelled to over 200 men, a ragged column of humanity united by the simple desire to survive. The sounds of fighting grew louder as they approached the fluid front lines. They could see smoke rising from burning vehicles and buildings ahead. An American observation plane flew low overhead, circling back around as if to get a better look at the unusual column moving toward the front lines rather than away from it. This made everyone nervous. Would they be mistaken for a counterattack? Would artillery or aircraft fire on them, despite the white flag? Ernst suggested they stop and make their surrender flag more visible. Several men worked to tie the white sheet to a long pole, raising it high above the column. They also spread out more, making it clear they were not in military formation. Some men removed their uniform jackets, further emphasizing their intention to surrender. As the afternoon wore on, they entered an area that had clearly seen intense recent combat. Destroyed German vehicles lined the road, their hulls still smoking. Craters from artillery shells pockmarked the landscape, and then, coming around a bend in the road, they saw them, American soldiers. The lead element was a patrol from the 2nd Armored Division, moving cautiously through the terrain in a half-track followed by several Sherman tanks. The Americans spotted the column of Germans simultaneously, and there was a tense moment as weapons swung toward them. Klaus felt his heart hammering in his chest. Everything depended on the next few seconds. Ernst stepped forward, hands raised high, the white flag clearly visible. In carefully pronounced English, he called out the phrases he had practiced. "We surrender. Don't shoot. We are prisoners." For a long moment, nothing happened. The American soldiers remained behind their weapons, clearly unsure what to make of this large group approaching them. Then, an officer emerged from the half-track, a lieutenant with a careful expression and a Thompson submachine gun held ready but not aimed directly at them. The lieutenant called out something in English that neither Klaus nor Ernst fully understood, but the meaning was clear. "Stop where you are." The column halted. More American vehicles appeared, surrounding the Germans on three sides. Soldiers dismounted, weapons ready, maintaining careful distance and fields of fire. What followed was a tense but ultimately orderly process. The Americans seemed to have procedures for this. Small groups of Germans were directed to move forward, lay down any weapons they had, and submit to searches. It was methodical and professional. The American soldiers were watchful and alert, but not cruel. They checked for concealed weapons, but didn't beat or abuse the prisoners. Medical personnel arrived and began triaging the wounded, including Klaus. An American medic, a young man probably no older than Klaus himself, examined the injured leg with gentle efficiency. "You need a field hospital," the medic said in broken German. "Infection bad." The care was basic, but more than Klaus had received in days. A proper bandage, clean for the first time, sulfanilamide powder to combat infection, even a small dose of morphine for the pain. As the sun set on that April evening, Klaus Zimmermann found himself sitting on the ground, surrounded by 200 other German soldiers, all now prisoners of war. They were given water and some rations, basic but adequate. American guards maintained watch, but without the brutality or vindictiveness that might have been expected. They were processed, given prisoner numbers, and told they would be moved to a rear area holding facility the following day. Klaus looked around at the faces of his fellow prisoners. He saw relief, exhaustion, and in many cases, something like hope. They had made it. Against the odds, defying orders and risking execution, they had surrendered to American forces. Whatever hardships lay ahead in captivity, they would face them alive with a reasonable expectation of surviving the war. But their story was just one small piece of a much larger phenomenon. In those final weeks of the European war, the trickle of German soldiers seeking to surrender to American forces became a flood. By late April, entire divisions were marching west, sometimes fighting through their own rearguard units to reach American lines. The motivation was universal: survival through surrender to an enemy known to follow international law, rather than face almost certain death or brutal captivity from Soviet forces. The morning after their surrender, Klaus and his fellow prisoners were loaded onto American trucks for transport to a larger POW facility. The drive took them further west, deeper into territory secured by Allied forces. Klaus watched the countryside pass by, noting the relative lack of destruction compared to areas he had seen on the Eastern Front. American forces, it seemed, were more selective in their use of firepower when civilian areas were involved. The POW facility they arrived at was a hastily erected tent city in an open field, surrounded by barbed wire and guarded by American military police. Already, thousands of German prisoners were housed there, with more arriving constantly. The scale of the surrender was staggering. Klaus learned from talking to other prisoners that this was just one of dozens of such facilities, all overflowing with captured German personnel. The camp was organized into compounds based on rank and, to some extent, which front the prisoners had been captured from. Klaus and Ernst found themselves in a section with other enlisted men from various Wehrmacht units. The conditions were basic, but not deliberately cruel. Each man was assigned to a tent that held approximately 20 prisoners. The tents provided shelter from rain, but did little against the cold April nights. Life in the camp fell into a routine quickly. The prisoners were organized by rank and unit as much as possible. Morning roll call happened at dawn, with American guards counting prisoners and checking for anyone who might have attempted escape during the night. not that escape was a realistic option. Where would they go? Germany was in ruins, divided between advancing Allied armies. The camp, for all its hardships, represented safety. Food was provided twice daily, basic but sufficient. Breakfast consisted of porridge or thin soup with bread. Dinner brought more substantial fare, usually stewed vegetables with occasional meat and more bread. The portions were not generous, but they were regular and predictable. After years of dwindling rations as Germany's supply lines collapsed, the reliability of meals was almost luxurious. Klaus noticed he was not losing weight in captivity, unlike during the final months of active service. Medical care was available, and Klaus found himself in a field hospital tent where doctors, including some captured German medical officers working under American supervision, treated his infected leg wound properly. The American medical staff were professional and thorough. They cleaned the wound properly, removing infected tissue, and administered antibiotics that actually worked. An American doctor, Captain Robert Morrison from Pennsylvania, examined Klaus's leg and spoke to him through a translator. "You're lucky," the captain said. "Another week without treatment and we would have been amputating. The infection was severe. But we caught it in time. You'll recover fully, though the scar will be significant." Klaus felt overwhelming gratitude, mixed with a strange sense of irony. Here he was, receiving better medical care from his former enemies than he had received from his own military in the field. The Americans had resources that Germany could no longer match: fresh bandages, modern antibiotics, adequate surgical supplies. Everything that had become desperately scarce in German field hospitals was available here in abundance. Within days, the fever broke and the infection began to clear. The care was professional and effective, reinforcing everything Ernst had told him about American adherence to prisoner rights. Klaus could walk again without the intense pain, though he still limped and would for months to come. But the camp was also a place of stories, and Klaus spent his time recovering, listening to the accounts of other soldiers who had made similar desperate journeys to reach American lines. Each story reinforced the pattern. German soldiers fleeing not just defeat, but the specific terror of Soviet captivity. He met Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, a former company commander who had led his entire remaining unit of 80 men on a 3-day march to surrender to Americans rather than wait for Soviet forces to overtake their position. Friedrich was a 35-year-old career officer from Berlin who had served throughout the war. His decision to surrender his command had not been made lightly. "I knew we had lost the war by February of this year," Friedrich told Klaus one evening as they sat outside their tent. "The question then became not how to win, but how to ensure my men had a chance to survive and return home to their families someday. On the Eastern Front, surrender meant death or Siberia. Here, with the Americans, at least we have a chance." Friedrich's story included harrowing details of their march west. They had to fight through German military police at one checkpoint, resulting in casualties on both sides. The military police, fanatical in their enforcement of orders to hold positions, had tried to turn Friedrich's unit back. When Friedrich and his men refused, shots were exchanged. 3 of Friedrich's soldiers died in that encounter, along with 2 military policemen. It was Germans killing Germans in the final days of a lost war, a tragedy that encapsulated the madness of fighting on when all was already decided. The choice had become that stark, Friedrich continued. Risk death by execution for desertion, or face almost certain death through Soviet captivity. My men trusted me to make the right decision. Some of them have families in areas now controlled by the Russians. They may never see those families again. But at least they're alive, and maybe someday there will be a chance for reunion. Klaus also befriended a young Luftwaffe pilot named Hans Richter in the camp. Hans was 22 from Munich and had been flying combat missions since 1943. His story offered yet another angle on the mass surrender. Hans had crash-landed his damaged fighter near American lines and then walked for 2 days to surrender, rather than try to return to German-held territory. "In the air, you see everything," Hans explained one afternoon, as several prisoners sat together in the weak April sunshine. By April, the Luftwaffe barely existed anymore. No fuel, few planes, pilots flying obsolete aircraft against overwhelming Allied air superiority. Every mission was suicide. I knew pilots who deliberately crash-landed near American positions just to survive. Shot down by the Americans meant a chance at life. Shot down by Soviets or crashing in Soviet territory meant you disappeared forever. Hans described his final mission in vivid detail. He had been flying a Focke-Wulf 190, an aircraft that had been competitive in earlier years of the war, but was now outmatched by American P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts. His squadron of 12 planes had taken off to intercept an American bomber formation. They never reached the bombers. American fighters ambushed them en route, and within minutes, half the squadron was shot down. Hans's plane took hits in the engine and wing. He managed to keep it flying long enough to clear the immediate combat area, then crash-landed in a field. He was unhurt except for bruises, and he found himself in a strange situation. He was approximately 5 kilometers behind American lines, but still theoretically capable of evading capture and returning to German territory. He chose not to try. "I sat in that field for an hour," Hans told Klaus, "just thinking about what to do. I could try to get back, face another mission the next day, or the day after that, until eventually I got killed. Or I could walk toward the Americans and surrender. It wasn't really a choice. I wanted to live. I wanted to see my parents again, maybe get married someday, have a normal life. So I started walking west." The stories accumulated, each one a personal testament to the same calculation. The Americans represented survival, not comfortable survival, not freedom, but the reasonable expectation of living through captivity and eventually returning home when the war ended. Klaus noticed something interesting about the camp's social dynamics. The prisoners were beginning to discuss what had happened during the war, particularly on the Eastern Front. These conversations were difficult and often painful. Men wrestled with what they had witnessed, what they had participated in, and what it meant for Germany's future. One evening, a group of prisoners sat in a circle talking about this. Otto Brandt, the older Volksturm member from the village, spoke about what needed to happen after the war. "We cannot pretend we did not know," he said quietly. "We saw things. We heard things. Maybe we did not participate directly, but we allowed it to happen. We have a responsibility to acknowledge that and ensure it never happens again." Not everyone agreed with this perspective. Some prisoners insisted they were just following orders, that they had no choice, that they were victims of the Nazi regime as much as anyone. Others argued that collective guilt was unfair, that individuals should only be judged for their own actions. The debates were intense, but generally remained civil. Everyone understood they were facing a difficult future and needed to think carefully about Germany's path forward. Ernst contributed his own perspective to these discussions. "I saw villages burned," he said one night. "I saw prisoners treated in ways that violated every rule of warfare. I did not participate in the worst of it, but I was there. I wear a German uniform, and that means I bear some responsibility. We all do. The question is what we do with that responsibility. Do we deny it, or do we acknowledge it and work to build something better?" These conversations in the POW camp were perhaps the first time many of these men had openly discussed the moral dimensions of what Germany had done during the war. In active service, such discussions were dangerous and could result in accusations of defeatism or sedition. But here, in American captivity, with the war clearly lost, they could speak more freely. It was a kind of moral reckoning that would continue for decades after the war ended. By contrast, the Eastern Front promised only death or disappearance into the vast Soviet labor camp system from which few returned. As April turned to May, the camp population continued to swell. Entire units were surrendering en masse now. Klaus witnessed the arrival of a column of over 10,000 soldiers who had fought their way west through their own lines to surrender. The American forces, stretched thin and often overwhelmed by the sheer numbers, struggled to process and contain all the prisoners. At times the camp seemed barely controlled, yet the Americans maintained their procedural approach. Names were recorded, medical needs were addressed, basic necessities were provided. On May 7th, word spread through the camp that Germany had unconditionally surrendered. The war in Europe was over. The reaction among the prisoners was complex. Relief that the fighting had ended, grief for the devastation of their homeland, shame at the crimes that had been committed in Germany's name, and above all, gratitude that they had survived. Klaus sat with Ernst and several other prisoners that evening, watching the sun set over the American camp. The war that had consumed Europe and cost tens of millions of lives had finally ended. They were prisoners, yes, but they were alive. They had families they might someday return to. They had futures, however uncertain. In the months that followed, the full scope of what they had feared became clearer. Reports filtered in about the fate of German prisoners in Soviet hands. The stories were as terrible as imagined. Mass deaths from exposure and starvation, forced labor in brutal conditions, prisoners held for years, even decades in some cases. Of the hundreds of thousands captured by Soviet forces in the final battles, many tens of thousands died within the first year of captivity. The Soviets made little effort to hide their treatment of German prisoners, seeing it as justified retribution for German atrocities committed during the invasion and occupation of Soviet territory. The contrast with American captivity was stark. While conditions in the American POW camps were far from luxurious, prisoners were treated according to Geneva Convention standards. They were fed, housed, given medical care, and eventually, most were repatriated to Germany in the years following the war. The calculation made by Klaus, Ernst, and hundreds of thousands of other German soldiers had been correct. Surrender to Americans meant survival. Klaus spent 2 years in American captivity, first in camps in Germany and later in facilities in the United States, where German POWs were used for agricultural labor. The transfer to America came 6 months after his initial capture, part of a program to use prisoner labor while simultaneously reducing the burden on European resources during the difficult post-war period. The journey across the Atlantic was surreal. Klaus traveled on a Liberty ship converted for prisoner transport, crammed below decks with hundreds of other German POWs. The conditions were crowded but not cruel. They received adequate food and water, and the American guards were professional, if not friendly. Many of the prisoners had never seen an ocean before, and despite their circumstances, there was a sense of adventure mixed with their uncertainty about what awaited them in America. Klaus ended up at a POW camp in rural Iowa, assigned to work on farms that were short of labor due to American men serving in the Pacific Theater. The work was hard but not brutal. He spent his days harvesting corn and soybeans, working alongside a small group of other German prisoners under the supervision of local farmers. The American farm families he worked for treated him with a mixture of suspicion and pragmatic acceptance. They needed the labor, and Klaus was willing to work. One farmer, a man named Robert Henderson, was particularly kind. Robert's son had been killed at Normandy, yet he treated Klaus with basic human decency. One day, as they took a break from harvesting, Robert spoke to Klaus through a translator about his son. "I don't hold you personally responsible," Robert said. "You're just a young man who got caught up in something bigger than yourself, same as my boy." The politicians and generals, they start the wars. Regular people like us, we just die in them. Klaus was paid a small wage for his labor, as required by the Geneva Convention. The amount was minimal, but he could use it to purchase small luxuries at the camp store: chocolate, cigarettes for trading, toiletries. More importantly, he could send and receive letters from his family in Hamburg. This connection to home was psychologically crucial. Through letters, he learned that his mother and sister had survived the war, though their apartment building had been destroyed in the Hamburg firebombing of 1943. They were living with relatives, struggling with severe food shortages, but alive. Charlotte, his younger sister, wrote about life in occupied Hamburg. The British military government had taken control, and the city was being slowly cleared of rubble. Food was rationed strictly, and many people were on the edge of starvation, but she also wrote about small signs of hope. Schools were reopening. The systematic process of denazification was underway, though it was creating its own controversies and hardships. Germany was being forced to confront what had happened during the 12 years of Nazi rule. The letters from home made Klaus think deeply about his future. What would he do when he returned? Teaching seemed the obvious answer, but what would he teach? How could he stand in front of a classroom and discuss mathematics or literature without also discussing the moral catastrophe that had befallen Germany? How could education in post-war Germany avoid the indoctrination that had contributed to the rise of Nazism in the first place? In the POW camp, Klaus began organizing informal discussion groups with other educated prisoners. They talked about philosophy, politics, and the future of Germany. Some prisoners remained bitter and resentful, clinging to Nazi ideology even in defeat. But many others were engaged in a genuine process of reflection and reassessment. They read books provided by the American Camp Library, including works by authors that had been banned in Nazi Germany. They debated democracy, human rights, and how to prevent future tyrannies. An American officer, Captain James Sullivan, occasionally attended these discussions. Captain Sullivan had been a professor of history at Yale before the war and was interested in understanding the German perspective. His questions were pointed but not accusatory. He wanted to understand how an educated, cultured nation like Germany had descended into barbarism. The conversations were difficult for everyone involved, but important. The work was basic, but not brutal. He spent his days harvesting corn and soybeans, working alongside a small group of other German prisoners under the supervision of local farmers. The American farm families he worked for treated him with a mixture of suspicion and pragmatic acceptance. They needed the labor, and Klaus was willing to work. Through these experiences, Klaus slowly began to process the trauma of the war years. The physical distance from Europe, the relative peace of rural Iowa, the opportunity for reflection, all contributed to a kind of healing. He started to understand that his survival carried responsibilities. He had witnessed terrible things. He had been part of a military machine that committed systematic atrocities. Now he had an obligation to remember, to testify, to help ensure it never happened again. When Klaus was finally repatriated to Germany in 1947, he returned to Hamburg to find his family alive but struggling in the devastated city. His mother had aged terribly during the war years, her health broken by malnutrition and stress. Charlotte had become the family's primary breadwinner, working in reconstruction efforts that were slowly rebuilding Hamburg from its ruins. The reunion with his mother was emotionally overwhelming. She embraced him, weeping, hardly able to believe he had survived. So many families had lost sons, husbands, fathers. The fact that Klaus had come home at all was almost miraculous. His mother had prepared a small meal from her rations, stretching what little she had to celebrate his return. As they ate together that first evening, Klaus told them about his experiences. Not the worst of what he had seen. He could not bear to share those memories yet, but about his journey west, his capture by Americans, his time in the POW camps. His mother listened with tears streaming down her face. "You were smart to go west," she said. "The families of boys who were captured by the Russians, they wait and wait, but no one comes home." Charlotte told Klaus about the challenges of life in occupied Germany. The British authorities were strict, but generally fair. Food was scarce, but aid was beginning to arrive from international relief organizations. The process of rebuilding was painfully slow. But there was also a sense that Germany was being given a chance to start over, to build a democratic society free from militarism and totalitarianism. Klaus found work teaching again, first in temporary schools set up in undamaged buildings, and later in a reconstructed gymnasium. His approach to teaching had changed fundamentally. He no longer saw his role as simply imparting knowledge of mathematics or science. He felt obligated to teach critical thinking, to encourage his students to question authority, to never blindly follow orders or ideology. The Nazi period had demonstrated the dangers of obedience without moral reflection. He resumed teaching, this time to children growing up in the ruins of the Reich that had promised 1,000 years of glory and delivered only destruction. In his classroom, Klaus created an environment where students could ask difficult questions. What happened? How did it happen? How do we prevent it from happening again? He shared his own experiences, appropriately edited for young audiences, to illustrate the consequences of militarism and totalitarianism. His students were children of the war, many of them orphaned or from broken families. They lived in a city of ruins, surrounded by physical evidence of Germany's defeat. Klaus tried to give them hope, while also being honest about what had occurred. Germany must rebuild, he told them, but first it must understand what went wrong. We cannot simply forget or pretend the Nazi period did not happen. We must study it, understand it, and learn from it. Some parents objected to Klaus's approach, feeling he was too critical of Germany or dwelling too much on the war. But most appreciated his honesty. They recognized that their children needed education that would prevent future catastrophes, not just technical knowledge. Klaus became known as an effective but demanding teacher, someone who pushed students to think deeply about moral and political questions as well as academic subjects. Ernst Hoffmann was repatriated several months earlier than Klaus. His journey home to his small Bavarian town was filled with dread and hope in equal measure. He had not heard from his family since shortly before his capture, and he did not know what he would find. The train journey from the processing center took him through landscapes of destruction. Cities reduced to rubble, bridges destroyed, countryside scarred by combat. Germany had been thoroughly defeated, and the evidence was everywhere. When Ernst finally reached his town, he found it had been occupied by American forces and then turned over to the new Bavarian government under Allied supervision. His house was still standing, one of the few that had escaped major damage. As he walked up the familiar street, neighbors came out to watch. Some greeted him warmly, grateful to see any soldier return alive. Others looked away, uncomfortable with the presence of veterans who represented Germany's shameful past. Ernst knocked on his own door, hardly daring to hope. His wife Maria answered, and for a moment she simply stared at him, as if unable to believe he was real. Then she collapsed into his arms, sobbing. They held each other for long minutes, neither able to speak through their emotion. Inside, Ernst learned the full extent of what his family had endured. His wife and children had survived, but barely. 2 of his 3 children had been killed. His oldest son, Friedrich, the one Ernst had worried about being conscripted into the Volkssturm, had indeed been forced into service in February of 45. He had been killed in fighting near Munich in late April, just days before the war ended. He was 16 years old. His daughter Anna had died in an Allied bombing raid in March. She had been helping at a field hospital, doing volunteer work despite being only 14, when American bombers hit what they believed to be a military target nearby. The bombs fell wide, destroying several civilian buildings, including the hospital. Anna had been buried in the rubble. It took 2 days to recover her body. Only his youngest son, Peter, had survived, now 11 years old and deeply traumatized by everything he had witnessed. Peter barely remembered his father, and he was frightened by this gaunt stranger who claimed to be the man who had left for war when Peter was only 5 years old. The grief nearly destroyed Ernst. He had survived the war, had made it through Soviet territory without being captured, had endured American captivity, all with the hope of returning to his family. Now he discovered that 2 of his 3 children were dead, killed in the final months of a war that was already lost. The senselessness of it, the cruel timing, was almost unbearable. For months after his return, Ernst struggled with severe depression. He found work as a machinist in reconstruction efforts, using skills he had learned before the war. The physical labor helped somewhat, giving him something to focus on besides his grief, but nights were difficult. He dreamed of his children, of Friedrich dying in some pointless last-stand battle, of Anna trapped under rubble as the building collapsed around her. Maria was his anchor during this dark period. She too was grieving, but she had already lived with the loss for months and had begun to process it. She helped Ernst understand that they had to go on for Peter's sake. Their surviving son needed parents who could function, who could help him recover from his own trauma. Gradually, Ernst found reasons to keep living. He reconnected with Peter, slowly building a relationship with the son who had grown up without him. He attended community meetings about reconstruction. He joined a support group for veterans struggling with the aftermath of war. Ernst and Klaus maintained correspondence for years after the war, bound by their shared experience of those desperate days in April 1945 when they made the choice that saved their lives. Their letters discussed not just personal matters, but also larger questions about Germany's future. Both men felt a responsibility to help ensure that what happened during the Nazi period would never be repeated. In one letter from 1950, Ernst wrote to Klaus about his evolving understanding of what they had lived through. "We survived because we made a choice," he wrote. "We chose to surrender to Americans rather than Soviets. That choice was based on our understanding of what we had done on the Eastern Front and what consequences we deserved. The Americans gave us mercy we did not necessarily deserve. They treated us according to law when they could have treated us according to revenge. I think often about that, about how mercy is a choice, not an obligation. The Americans chose mercy. We must remember that and honor it by building a Germany that deserves such mercy." Klaus kept that letter for the rest of his life. It expressed something he too felt, but had struggled to articulate. They had been shown a kind of grace that they had no right to expect. That grace carried an obligation to do better, to be better, to help build a society that would never again descend into the barbarism of the Nazi era. The question of why 500,000 German soldiers chose capture by Americans rather than face Soviet forces is answered not by a single factor, but by a convergence of realities. The systematic atrocities committed by German forces on the Eastern Front created an expectation of retribution that was well-founded. Soviet treatment of German prisoners reflected both the brutality they had experienced and a different philosophical approach to prisoner rights. By contrast, American forces, while far from perfect, operated within a framework of international law and military discipline that provided basic protections to prisoners of war. German soldiers in the war's final months made rational calculations based on available information. They knew what awaited them if captured by Soviet forces, because they had seen or participated in what German forces had done during the invasion and occupation of Soviet territory. They understood that retribution would be severe. They also had enough information about American practices, passed through soldier accounts and intelligence reports, to know that surrender to American forces offered a genuine chance of survival and eventual return home. The mass surrender to American forces in April and early May of 1945 represents one of the most significant military capitulations in modern history. It occurred not because of battlefield defeat alone, though the German military situation was hopeless, but because individual soldiers made conscious choices about how they wanted to survive the end of the war. They voted with their feet, often at great personal risk, to seek out the captor they believed would treat them with at least basic humanity. The American military, for its part, was overwhelmed by the scale of the surrender. Processing, housing, feeding and guarding hundreds of thousands of prisoners strained resources and logistics, yet the Americans maintained their commitment to prisoner rights, even under difficult circumstances. This adherence to international law, even toward enemies who had committed terrible crimes, stands as a significant aspect of how the Western Allies conducted the final phase of the European War. The experience of Klaus Zimmermann and the hundreds of thousands of soldiers who made similar choices illustrates the human dimension of history's great military conflicts. Beyond strategy and tactics, beyond ideologies and grand narratives, individual human beings made desperate calculations about survival. They evaluated their options based on available information and chose the path they believed offered the best chance to live through the war and return to their families. That so many made the same choice, risking execution for desertion to reach American rather than Soviet lines, speaks volumes about the realities of the war's final phase. Today, when historians study the end of World War II in Europe, they often focus on the military campaigns, the destruction of German forces, and the eventual division of Europe that would define the Cold War. But the story of the mass surrender to American forces reveals another dimension, the individual agency of soldiers faced with terrible choices, the power of reputation and expectation in shaping behavior, and the significance of maintaining legal and ethical standards even in the chaos of war's end. Klaus Zimmermann's journey from that field hospital in the Ruhr Valley to American captivity and eventual return home was shared by hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. Their collective decision to surrender to Americans rather than Soviets shaped the final weeks of the European War and influenced the post-war period. It demonstrated that even in total war, even among defeated forces, soldiers retained the ability to choose their fate within the narrow options available to them. And their choice, repeated thousands of times across collapsing front lines, was to seek survival through surrender to an enemy known to follow rules, rather than face an enemy justified in seeking revenge. That 500,000 German soldiers made this choice tells us something profound about both the conduct of American forces and the desperate circumstances that drove men to risk everything for a chance at survival. The legacy of these surrenders extended far beyond the immediate post-war period. Many of the German soldiers who surrendered to American forces and survived captivity became important voices in the reconstruction of Germany. Having experienced both the brutality of the Eastern Front and the relative restraint of American captivity, they understood the value of democratic institutions and international law. Some, like Klaus, dedicated their post-war lives to teaching younger generations about the costs of militarism and the importance of peace. Others worked to rebuild German civil society on democratic principles, forming a bridge between the devastation of the Nazi period and the emergence of modern democratic Germany. The American treatment of German POWs, while not perfect, established precedents that would influence international humanitarian law in subsequent decades. The experience demonstrated that even in the context of total war against an enemy that had committed systematic atrocities, it was possible to maintain legal and ethical standards in the treatment of prisoners. This would become an important reference point in discussions of military conduct and prisoner rights in later conflicts. For the survivors, the memories of those desperate days remained vivid for the rest of their lives. Klaus Zimmermann, who lived until 1998, often spoke to his students about his experiences. Not glorifying war, not minimizing German crimes, but honestly recounting the human dimension of those final months when the choice between different forms of captivity literally meant the difference between life and death. His message was always the same. War unleashes forces that destroy the lives of ordinary people on all sides, and the only true victory is preventing such conflicts from occurring in the first place. The story of why 500,000 German soldiers chose capture by American forces is ultimately a story about fear, hope, and survival. Fear of well-justified Soviet retribution for German crimes on the Eastern Front. Hope that American adherence to international law would provide a path to survival, and the fundamental human drive to live even in the face of defeat and devastation. These soldiers made a choice that acknowledged their defeat, accepted captivity, and bet their lives on the mercy of strangers who had every reason to hate them. That so many survived, that gamble speaks to both their desperate courage and the principled conduct of American forces who could have chosen vengeance, but instead chose to uphold the rules of war even toward a thoroughly defeated enemy. In the end, this was the terror that drove German soldiers to seek American captivity, not fear of the Americans themselves, but the knowledge of what they had done on the Eastern Front and the understanding that Soviet forces would remember.